Welcome to episode 345 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Tom Burg, who served in the FBI for 32 years. In this episode, Tom reviews his 1970s domestic terrorism conspiracy case to overthrow the U.S. government with laser weaponry. During the 3-year-long case, cooperating witness, Wausau, Wisconsin scientist Mike Muckerhide provided invaluable information about the activities of dangerous right-wing extremists who included a chemist, a Wisconsin assemblyman, and a Guatemalan deputy defense minister. After the conclusion of this investigation, Mike Muckerhide became a successful contributor to the development of laser science, working for hospitals, NASA, and the U.S. Department of Defense. Tom Burg assisted author Sharon Thatcher with writing a true crime book about this laser weaponry conspiracy investigation. On the Laser's Edge, the conspiracy, code word to call. Tom's first assignment was the Jackson Division in Mississippi and the Laurel Resident Agency. His second office was the Chicago Division, where he worked out of the Waukegan RA. Later in his career, he received an Office of Preference transfer to the Milwaukee Division, where he was assigned as the Senior Resident Agent in the Wausau RA. Tom received the U.S. Department of Justice Award for Public Service, and he was a certified police instructor for sex crimes, crimes against persons, and interviewing techniques. After retiring from the FBI, Tom was employed as a security advisor for the U.S. Figure Skating Association, adjunct faculty member of North Central Technical College, where he taught interviewing, and was involved with Crime Stoppers of Lincoln County, Wisconsin. Tom wrote his first novel, Accidental Sheriff, in 2022. The title of his latest release is Devious. You can find Tom's ebooks on Amazon and order print books at mainudesign.com. Now, before we get to the case review, I just want to let you know I'm trying to find a space, a free space, for me to hold a live event in Washington, D.C., similar to the one that I held in Philadelphia. This would be on either March the 16th or March the 17th. I would have a author discussion on FBI myths and misconceptions, and then invite a few of my former guests up for a Ask Us Anything panel. So if you know of a spot in Washington, D.C. or in Northern Virginia, please let me know at jerrywilliamsauthor@gmail.com. If you are listening to this episode when it first comes out, please know that I will be putting out my February Reader Team email on Monday, February 3rd. And in it, I will be reviewing 4 teachable moments about the FBI, the movie The Order, starring Jude Law, and I will include comments from one of the case agents that actually worked that FBI domestic terrorism investigation. I want to welcome new listeners. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a link to join my reader team where I talk about crime fiction, and you can learn more about the FBI in books, TV, and movies, find links to buy me a cup of coffee, and discover my books. Available as ebooks and paperbacks wherever books are sold, and audiobooks on Audible and Spotify. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agent Tom Burg. Hey, Tom, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
I actually put a call out to retired agents for them to share their cases on FBI Retired Case File Review, from predication to sentencing. That's what I like. When I heard from you, I knew that this would be a case review like no others. because I've shared investigations featuring informants and domestic terrorism, but I've never shared a case review based on laser technology. So this is a domestic terrorism case that most people will be absolutely amazed to hear about.
I'm happy to talk about it because for decades it's been the greatest story never told. People didn't understand it when it happened in 1978 and 79 here in Wisconsin. It just became unknown, and it highlights all kind of things like the lone wolves that are out there conspiring against our government and to do all kind of terrorist things.
And it's great timing too, because there's a brand new movie all about the Order, which I know you know a lot about that organization and the FBI's case on that domestic terrorism group. So this is like perfect timing.
Good.
All right. So where do you want to start? This is your show.
Well, it starts in the 1970s with laser technology. It was really in its infancy then, experimental. Since then, lasers have developed so much, and we find them in our everyday uses, good and bad, medical, industrial, military, even entertainment. And lasers are common things to us now, but they're mainstream. But back then, people viewed lasers as something like Buck Rogers or Flash Gordon death rays and things like that, and considered it basically fiction. And that wasn't just people outside the FBI. I had a lot of non-believers within our organization as well. But to mention a little bit about the science of it, lasers are parallel and focused beams of light waves. They can be very intense and very powerful and destructive. One of the side effects of working with lasers is danger to the eyes. They can easily blind a person. And we occasionally see today in the news where somebody on the ground shines a laser beam into the air at an airplane, and there's the danger of blinding airline pilots with a plane load of passengers, but maybe coming into land or something like that.
And what you're saying, I really understand because you're thinking of lasers like something that you would read in a comic book or in a science fiction novel. At the very end of the episode, you and I are going to discuss the fact that you have started writing crime fiction, but this is not fiction. This is a true crime case. I can't wait to hear more about it.
Good. In fact, I had that very thing happen. The book on the case, On the Laser's Edge by Sharon Thatcher, is, of course, in our local library. And I went looking for it and couldn't find it. And I finally came up with it in the fiction shelves. And I took it to the head librarian and I said, look, at the back of the book, the first thing it says is the true story. And so they, of course, put it in the right place. But people just don't believe it's a true story. Basically, it's the story of a man named Mike Muckerheide, a pioneer laser scientist. Mike was born and raised in Wausau, Wisconsin, from a working class family. And early on, he learned about electricity by helping his father electrify homes that had previously been equipped with gas lighting. He went to a Catholic parochial school. It was noticed immediately that he had an intellectual gift, and they were able to arrange through one of Mike's uncles, who was a Catholic priest, to get a scholarship to a private prep school in Minnesota, where Mike thereafter went to school. After high school, he went into the Navy, became a hospital corpsman, served as a medic in the Korean War. Afterward, he worked as a hospital surgical assistant. And he worked at the Mayo Clinic for a while. While he was there doing his regular job, he tinkered with medical instruments and invented various things to do the job better. He married and returned to Wausau to work at the hospital here. And the same thing happened. They found that his experiments with medical equipment were very successful and led to some good things, so they gave him a lab of his own. Mike was watching television, and Theodore Maiman, the inventor of the laser, was on demonstrating a laser. And Mike said this changed his life. He sort of became the local mad scientist, experimenting with lasers, with materials from the junkyard, for instance. But he would be out doing what we now see light shows, lights flashing. And he worked in an abandoned quarry, burning things with laser beams. And even the sheriff's department was very skeptical of him at that time. One of his inventions was he worked with a phone company, and they invented a way to send EKG signals over phone lines. At that time in rural northern Wisconsin, there weren't cardiologists to be able to read the EKGs except in maybe Madison or Milwaukee or Mayo Clinic. And that was one of his first big successes. They even ran tests from Wausau to Hawaii and to Bangkok, Thailand, to show that it worked. And then he also invented ways to send x-rays over the telephone lines, working with a local phone company. He really was recognized locally as a genius, but a practical genius, not the theoretical type. He was kind of like the self-taught computer pioneers of the 80s and 90s, on the cutting edge. In the early 1970s, Mike experienced a visit at home from an investment counselor named John Clausen. John was wanting to sell investments, but also wanted and enjoyed talking politics. And John was very conservative, very religious, and he kept coming back. He's been described as like something stuck on your shoe. This was the Vietnam era, and John always talked politics with Mike and kept telling Mike that he had a friend who was a scientist that he wanted Mike to meet. Finally, after much fanfare, George Wallace was coming to Wausau on a campaign visit, and Clausen told Mike if he would come along, he would introduce him to his friend. Well, that friend turned out to be a man named Albert Iwan, who is from Merrill, Wisconsin, just north of Wausau. He's a chemist. He had very strong academic credentials. He'd worked at the Redstone Arsenal with military weaponry. He had a plane. He was a pilot. And he was currently involved from a laboratory he operated in Mosinee, Wisconsin, which is also near Wausau, producing Laetrile, which was then the very controversial cancer drug. It was claimed to cure cancer, but the FDA would not approve it because they said it didn't. And he was having a very highly public battle with the FDA. Politically, Iwan was very right-wing. He moved in a number of circles, and he had friends in the Wisconsin Posse Comitatus through its leader, Thomas Stockheimer, who worked for Iwan in his Laetrile laboratory. Iwan was a very secretive and manipulative type guy.
Could you tell us a little bit more about Posse Comitatus and what that group is about?
Absolutely. Posse Comitatus is listed by the Southern Poverty Law Center, which documents these right-wing organizations, and the Department of Justice, as founded in the early 1970s as an anti-government organization. It was a blend of Christian identity movement, which is white supremacist extremism, and the sovereign citizen thinking, citizen government, and no authority to the federal government. They were tax protesters. Even the FBI described it as aligned with the Ku Klux Klan and the Aryan Nation. Later, this organization in 1983 came to the public's attention when a Posse Comitatus member in North Dakota, Gordon Call, murdered 2 United States Marshals there. So, and when then later in the siege in Montana with the Montana Freemen who were aligned with the Posse Comitatus. So this was a highly known, well-known right-wing organization going back to the 70s.
I've recorded a case review already about the Posse Comitatus. It's episode 172 with retired agent Wason Dunn. We talk about a group in Nebraska that was espousing Posse Comitatus rhetoric. I'll put a link in the show notes for this episode if anyone is interested in also listening to that case review.
They were much the same, whether it be Nebraska or Wisconsin. The posse had a foothold in central Wisconsin among farmers. There were farm price problems at the time and various blue-collar workers. Stockheimer came to law enforcement attention in 1974 when he organized a group to abduct an IRS agent. They held him against his will, assaulted him, and Stockheimer was arrested and charged. He jumped bond and became an FBI fugitive. At that time, the FBI worked the fugitive bond default cases from the courts. Those have since gone over to the Marshal Service. Stockheimer is listed in the Anti-Defamation League's glossary of extremists.
He doesn't seem like the type of a person that Mike, who you've described to us as a scientist and somebody who was interested in using lasers for good. Doesn't sound like the type of person he would want to be involved with.
Well, no, in Stockheimer, this is really background for Mike's credibility and what's coming when Mike assisted the FBI in finding Stockheimer as a fugitive. No, Stockheimer was the friend of Iwan and Iwan's connection to the posse, but Iwan is sort of like more of an elitist posse type than a posse member himself. And no, Stockheimer was not a friend of Mike's. Maybe this whole segment about Stockheimer could be encapsulated a little bit with Mike's helping the FBI find Stockheimer. Mike began to establish regular coffee meetings with John Clausen and Albert Iwan, and they, of course, talked politics. And a lot of what they talked about concerned Mike. He approached the FBI and told them what was happening. And at that time, the senior agent in Wausau was Jerry Southworth. Jerry was investigating the posse and recognized Clausen's name and encouraged Mike to continue to report on what they were saying. Mike became an FBI informant. At that time, anybody that was reporting to the FBI was fit in one pigeonhole, informant. We did not yet have the category of cooperating witness, which seemed to cover it better in certain circumstances later. Jerry wasn't sure where to document this information, so he placed it into the national case on the identity group. And basically, Mike was an intelligence gathering informant. Jerry didn't really get laser science. He was a former cop, and he wasn't sure of Mike's credibility, but he documented and followed it along. And Jerry had said of Mike as an informant, he dreaded his visits and he dreaded when he didn't visit. Mike reported that Iwan wanted lasers for much more than just medical or simple uses, and Jerry reported this to FBI headquarters. They told him to keep investigating. Some of what Mike reported that Iwan wanted to do was disturbing. He wanted to destroy a building in Chicago called the 1313 building at the University of Chicago because Iwan believed it housed a secret U.S. government. He wanted to fly a jet plane with a laser weapon to attack Cuba to create a confrontation between the Soviet Union and the U.S. Mike said that this could be done, and Iwan wanted to do it. Jerry instituted what many of us agents would do at a time like this, basically instituted some delaying tactics, wanting to find out more what's going on. Iwan wanted Mike to establish a laser laboratory to build this laser weapon. Jerry and Mike used cost as a reason to delay things out. Iwan was on hard times with his lateral battle with the FDA, and so that worked for a while. Then Iwan came up with the idea of finding a foreign government to fund laser weaponry. Southworth was trying to check out Iwan's bona fides and ran into a lot of difficulties within our government agencies. He suspected that Iwan might be working for some other agency, but nobody would talk to him about Iwan's background. And he determined, in his mind at least, that they were afraid it would divulge too much information about our weapon systems at the time. About this time, Southworth was transferred. Mike began working with another agent named Jack Page, a former military pilot. Jack also didn't really get the science of it, but took a similar path of reporting, delaying, and keeping the case alive. Mike at the time was very successful. He became research director of a private research laboratory in Wausau. He was also involved in laser surgery. So basically, to Iwan, his excuse was that they needed a secret laboratory and he didn't have one.
It seems to me that Iwan and Clausen, I'm just kind of surprised that they believed that he was on the same game plan with them. Because here he is, this scientist with legitimate background in science. I'm just wondering why they thought that he would be willing to use that knowledge for domestic terrorism purposes.
Well, actually, yes. It makes sense. Mike obviously was able to sell his position fairly well. He actually had less academic background than Iwan did in the sciences. And Iwan, of course, was the same way. Here's a guy with a great scientific background, PhD in chemistry, and he's of the same ilk, right-wing, anti-government.
So basically, at this point, the only reason Mike is still in communication with these two is because the FBI has asked him to continue talking to them and gathering information.
That's correct. I think at times Mike wanted out, and they were able to convince him to stay around because nobody knew where this was going at that time. In 1977, Iwan found a place to possibly have this secret laboratory for Mike to develop his laser weapon. Iwan had a friend and former associate at Redstone Arsenal named John Hartle from West Virginia. Iwan wanted to fly Mike to West Virginia to meet with Hartle. As it turned out, Iwan began having problems with the FDA, so he arranged to send Mike there commercially and sent him with a letter of introduction from Iwan. Well, the letter of introduction to Hartle from Iwan was signed DF, the initials DF, which in Iwan's mind meant Der Führer. Iwan fancied himself as being the Führer of the Fifth Reich. In fact, he wore suits regularly. On the back of one of his lapels, he would wear a swastika pin, which he would bend the lapel over and show only select people. That was the kind of guy Iwan was. In April 1977, Mike traveled to West Virginia. They picked him up at the airport, took him to Hartle's place as a possible lab site. Later, Iwan flew Mike to Colorado to meet with another right-wing group, Colonel Archibald Roberts, founder of the Committee to Restore the Constitution. Isn't it interesting how all these have names like that? But again, Mike begged off. The sites were proposed as laboratories, wouldn't suit him, and they continued this. Iwan became pretty trusting of Mike, and at some point here in 1977, he confided in Mike that the fugitive Thomas Stockheimer had been moved to the Hartle cabin in West Virginia to hide out. And Mike, of course, was asked by the FBI to travel there. Again, he did. He confirmed that Stockheimer was there, and subsequently that led to the arrest and a big raid by the FBI and West Virginia State Police, arresting Stockheimer at the Hartle cabin. It was a really successful, but also a very risky thing to do with a source. Mike was able to convince Iwan that the source must be somebody other than him, that he wasn't involved in it, and the plan continued for laser weaponry. Iwan even suggested some things like stealing the powerful laser from the laboratory at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, whose program Mike had been instrumental in founding. Iwan was still on hard times with the FDA, and so he suggested that one of the possibilities for financing laser weaponry might be a foreign government. In August, Iwan took a trip to Guatemala, where he became acquainted with Colonel Luis Federico Fuentes, who was the Deputy Minister of Defense there.
They must have really wanted this lab to go through because they were initially suspicious that Mike might have provided information about where Stockheimer was that led to his arrest. But it sounds like they quickly let that go, which indicates, again, how much they wanted Mike to build this lab for them.
You're right. And I think it had a lot to do with the simple financial situation of Iwan. He wanted a place to manufacture, and he was not getting it here in the United States because of the FDA. So he thought by making himself very attractive to a foreign government, he could manufacture Laetrile and make his fortune in the Laetrile business. Mike was having a banner year. He had established laser programs at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, at the North Central Technical Institute. He was Outstanding Citizen of the Year, was very successful in his field. He really was so busy and did not see it going anywhere and wanted out as an informant. Jack Page prevailed in convincing him to at least keep reporting what these guys are doing. In early 1978, Jack Page was transferred, and I was transferred in to replace him. Actually, we overlapped. I was here ahead of Jack's leaving, and Jack introduced me to Mike, and I took over working with Mike as a source and got to know him. Well, as luck had it in the Bureau, Some of us are square pegs in round holes. This one, I was in the right place at the right time for. My background is in chemistry, and it helped me understand what Mike was talking about and get along with Mike. I'd been around a lot of brainy people, understood scientists, and Mike and I hit it off very well.
So, unlike the previous two case agents, you got it. You knew lasers and you knew what he was talking about.
Yes, I did. It's still all a matter of timing, but yeah, that certainly helped. The posse was new to me, although I'd worked extremist work in my first office in Mississippi by working Klan cases. Still, I knew what extremists were like, and the science helped. Iwan then began talking about a new participant, a person that he had made friends with and could help them a lot in where they were going. It was State Assemblyman James R. Lewis from West Bend, Wisconsin. Lewis was the darling of the religious right of the Wisconsin Republican Party, had been proposed for a variety of Republican jobs in the state administration. Iwan kept dropping his name. And then Mike reported that Lewis and Iwan had taken a 2-week trip to Latin America, Central and South America, going to such countries as Nicaragua, Paraguay, Bolivia, Guatemala, somewhat unusual places in that they were all places with strong right-wing governments. This was in April of 1978. Lewis paved the way for their trip by having U.S. Senator Proxmire's office send messages to the embassies in these countries. And on their return, Iwan talked about his strong connection with Fuentes and the possibility of financing these laser weapons. Well, from a case agent standpoint, or at least an agent reporting what the informant is reporting, the introduction of a politician changed the scope of the investigation. FBI headquarters took an interest because of a politician that they didn't take an interest in the science, and that helped move things forward. From my perspective, I thought we needed to bring out Lewis in person. Iwan can talk third person about his friend Lewis all the time, but we needed him present, and Mike needed to meet him. And so I had Mike persist until that took place. In June 1978, Iwan flew to Madison and picked up Assemblyman Lewis, brought him back to Wisconsin, and they met Lewis, Iwan, John Clausen, and Mike at Ratke's Point Park in Wausau. It's a nice park on Lake Wausau. They sat at a picnic bench, and in conversation, Lewis made a variety of very domestic terrorist statements. He wanted to attack the O'Hare Airport Tower with a laser weapon, blinding all of the air traffic controllers and causing chaos in the skies. He agreed with Iwan's 1313 building, wanting to destroy it, his Cuban ideas, and Lewis said that he was expecting a call from Colonel Fuentes. This got things going. Now, instead of just being an intelligence case, I was able to open a substantive FBI investigation with Lewis, Iwan, Clausen as subject to the FBI case. What I opened it as was somewhat unusual. Where do you put this pigeonhole? I opened it as a neutrality matter case. Those of us retired agents know how we classify cases by the type of violation that's being committed. The neutrality matter case classification number was 2. In all the history of the FBI, we had over 200 classifications in numerical order, and this was case classification number 2, with number 1 being training matters. So it's one of those things that had been on the books a very long time, and nobody really seemed to know what that was. It was a pretty nebulous classification.
I can agree with that because I don't know what that means. Neutrality matters.
Yeah, it was in our handbook. It was a number of statutes like the Munitions Control Act, the Export Control Act. Basically, the idea of a neutrality case was that it's against the law for citizens making foreign policy outside of our government with another government of another country. And the politician got the Milwaukee front office attention. Previously, Milwaukee had always had a problem in our annual inspections from FBI headquarters because they didn't have any political corruption cases. And the answer to that was always the excuse, there's no political corruption in Wisconsin. Well, it almost became a joke that some fool had found some political corruption, and I was that fool.
So I don't know if you were a hero or now you've really ruined it for them for the future when they want to use that excuse again.
I don't think they knew either. It was very difficult with an old school FBI supervisor who didn't understand this at all. Luckily, I did have a very good special agent in charge, Jerry Hogan, who you might know his son Kevin, was a bureau agent. Anyway, Jerry was a great SAC and gave me great backing from the front office. At this point, a decision I made, I think, really helped move things along, and that was to get the U.S. attorney on board early on. I have kind of a principle of inclusion. The more people are involved, the more we get different ideas and we can all work together to get things going. And so I contacted and made an appointment with U.S. Attorney Frank Turkheimer in Madison, Wisconsin. I was kind of the new guy in the division, had been in the division maybe 6 months, and had not yet met Frank. I knew that Frank Turkheimer was a Carter appointee. In his past, he'd been a Watergate prosecutor on the John Connally, governor of Texas case. He was a professor at the University of Wisconsin and had been appointed as U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Wisconsin. Frank was a New Yorker. His reputation was of being impatient, uncooperative, and that he didn't like the FBI. Well, none of that mattered. I had not yet met Frank and wanted to make my own decisions. But my decision was that because of the broader nature of the case involving a state political figure, I had to get the U.S. attorney on board early. And this was probably the most crucial thing to the case success of anything, because now we became a team. I went to Madison, filled Frank in on what was going on, what I'd been hearing from Mike. And Frank wanted to meet Mike, be able to assess who his primary witness would be. He liked Mike. He said what we need next would be photographic proof that Lewis was involved with this group of people, Iwan, Clausen, Mike. By luck, Iwan had another meeting scheduled with Lewis. Lewis and his secretary girlfriend, Debbie, were traveling from Madison north to Eagle River, Wisconsin, and they made an appointment at the Holiday Inn in Stevens Point for lunch. We set up a surveillance on the lunch meeting. A Milwaukee agent and my A partner, Dick Zeekley, were inside with a briefcase camera at the lunch, and I was outside with a 35 millimeter camera with a motor drive to take pictures outside. After lunch, the group went out to the parking lot, and Mike had parked in a way that he could lift the lift gate of his Pinto station wagon and show a bunch of various laser toys and exhibits that he had in it to Iwan, Clausen, and Lewis. And as they were doing this, I did a drive-by in the bureau car with a camera with the motor drive. Well, unknown to me, Lewis's girlfriend, Debbie, saw me doing the drive-by and got the license number of the bureau car.
Oops.
Yep. Well, I've always been a lousy surveillance agent, probably too aggressive, but in any event, this one wasn't one I could have predicted. But what happened? Well, first of all, as you know, bureau cars are licensed like any other automobile. They don't have government plates on them. They're plain sedans. And in Wisconsin, their registrations were of various names and addresses, fictitious people, an address like out in the middle of Lake Michigan, for instance. The agent that licensed, like any other FBI agent given a task, had fun with it. And he registered some of the vehicles with names like Donald Duck and Dick Tracy. And my bureau car happened to come back to the name Matt Helm. Well, at that time, Matt Helm was this fictional private investigator, a character in Dean Martin movies.
I have to say that the agent who had that assignment, I don't know if he was thinking clearly, because if you have a fictitious registration, you're doing that to avoid suspicion. And when you have these comical names, that doesn't end the desire of the person to figure out who was in that car. That just keeps it going.
Well, and you described it very accurately, because that evening, Lewis was just wild. He stopped at each county on the way to Eagle River, Marathon County, Lincoln County, Oneida County, Vilas County, and went to the sheriff's department and told them that this car was following him and he wanted to know who it was. And when they kept giving him the registration of Matt Helm, he was just going crazy. Well, fortunately, when any of our plates were run by law enforcement, it got a hit in the Milwaukee FBI office. So Milwaukee was immediately hearing my plate being run and was calling me and telling me it's being run in those counties. Mike got a call that evening from Iowa saying that they had to meet. There was a problem. And it's almost Apollo. Apollo was their code for they needed to leave the country. The jig is up. They had a variety of codes set up by Clausen. This was kind of one of them. It will be very important later. But anyway, they met, and Iwan told Mike that Lewis had been photographed. They'd been photographed at the Holiday Inn. I certainly had to hide my bureau car in the garage, send it to Milwaukee immediately and trade for another. And I had Henry Curran, the senior resident agent in Madison, contact the head of Capitol Security, who we knew would be hearing from Lewis as well. His name is Bob Hamley, and he was a graduate of the FBI National Academy. And Henry talked to Hamley, and they got together an idea of some disinformation for Lewis, that Hamley asked Lewis if he knew anybody that was involved in drugs. And basically this implied that the person taking the pictures was taking pictures for a Laetrile investigation and not anything to do with the laser case. And the laser case could then continue on. But as a result of that, we had photographs of Lewis meeting with these people, and that was a giant step forward. It also created kind of the humorous joke about who is Matt Helm. People would ask me, who is Matt Helm? And of course, I was embarrassed by being burned in the surveillance and said, I can't tell you. Well, finally, when it came out and I admitted to being Matt Helm, nobody would believe it, that this glamorous Dean Martin fanny padding character could be me. And so anyway, that was a fun little side issue of it. Iwan now saw some urgency. His FDA problems were getting worse. He wanted to make lasers in the United States and ship them to Guatemala. Lewis wanted to make lasers in Guatemala. We couldn't do either. We couldn't make a laser weapon here and ship it to Guatemala. That would be a violation of the Export Control Act, the Munitions Control Act. We couldn't let Mike go to Guatemala because they'd have him there and could make whatever laser weapons they wanted. Here was a point where the law doesn't keep up with technology. Our laws can only codify what exists. So a brand new cutting-edge laser weapon wasn't covered by those Munitions Control and Export Control Acts. People are probably familiar today with laser sights, the little red dot as a result of a laser weapon sight. That was all that was in the law at that time regarding laser weaponry. So the believability factor became part of it. Everybody from FBI headquarters to, the idea of putting a laser in a plane and flying it as a weapon was so fantastic that a number of people didn't believe it. That created the need to maybe make a little bit more of a believable plot. And Mike discussed with them the idea of downsizing this to handheld laser weapons, which they liked. Fuentes was dealing with a guerrilla insurrection in his country that went on for many years and liked the idea of having that kind of weaponry.
Can you explain to us what kind of damage can be done by lasers?
Well, I will say that I only know a little bit about it. I know this much. Our military has laser weapons that can shoot down missiles, that can shoot down aircraft. We've seen the missiles in the Mideast being shot out of the sky, presumably by lasers. They can do a lot. And this was another of those problems, was getting good information about what lasers can do because our own government didn't want to tell publicly what they were all about.
All right, so even you and the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office wasn't clear on what could be done, but they knew that this domestic terrorism group wanted the technology, and you weren't willing to wait till they got it to see what was going to happen.
Well, yeah, if this were TV or the movies, you'd create the doomsday weapon, and then it would get out of hand, and you'd have a real problem. Well, we couldn't let that happen. There was a bureau case. We all know how stories go around the office of a bureau case where there was information on a trailer load of furs about to be stolen. And they said, well, let's take them all out of the trailer and only put in enough to make the statute applicable. And the boss in charge said, no, load them up. Well, you can guess what happened. When they were loaded up, somehow they were stolen and got out of the Bureau's control. And that boss got busted back to the streets in Chicago when I was there. And when he would walk through the squad room, every now and then some wag would shout from the back of the room, "Load him up." Well, I knew from that story that I couldn't allow this to be loaded up. We had to figure out another way to get around it.
As we would say today, to stop the threat.
Good way to put it. What we then decided was maybe instead of having Mike take a weapon to Guatemala, we could downsize it to videotapes. Mike could bring videotapes and show them what lasers could do. And Mike said that would work. He had videos in his work. We showed them to agents who understood the technology, who said, no, there was nothing classified in the videotapes. And that was kind of the way we proceeded from here, so that we didn't have to try to take some doomsday weapon and have it get out of our control. Fuentes had no money. Iwan had no money. Iwan and Lewis finally decided that they would find some investors, like-minded people, and they said they did. And so in September 1978, Iwan reported that Fuentes told Lewis he needed the weapons badly, and Iwan planned a trip in October 1978 for himself, Lewis, and Mike Muckerheide to travel to Guatemala. Iwan bought the tickets. They met in September in Wausau, the Howard Johnsons, for lunch. Mike was still skeptical, still trying to drag it out. Lewis showed letters from Colonel Fuentes. What he said in the letter was they needed their Tikal, Tikal. Tikal is a pre-Columbian ruins in Guatemala. And their cover story was that Lewis would be flying there to Guatemala so that Colonel Fuentes could take him to see the Guatemalan ruins and photograph Tikal. So it became a Tikal show, which was code for a laser weapon. At the end of this lunch, which I was covering outside, loosely surveilling.
Loosely surveilling in a different car.
Yes, very much so. And had learned my lesson. At the end of the lunch, I met with Mike and found that as they were leaving, Lewis had given him a box, said, "You may need this." Well, the box contained a .38 caliber revolver. So we were able to find a way to preserve the chain of evidence of that revolver, but make it available should Mike need it. We went to a local bank and got a safe deposit box with Mike and I as the signers. He didn't need it, as it turned out. But now all of them, Iwan and Lewis, even Clausen, were packing guns. They were getting ready for their revolution. Fuentes had suggested a freight forwarding company to smuggle weapons. Instead, Iwan said that they could do it as a relief shipment to Guatemala. He found a local minister to cover the use of this as a relief shipment. And so they were preparing to go to Guatemala. The tickets were dated October 13th, 1978. As we approached that, we couldn't let this happen. So I suggested that we do a taped conversation, Mike taping a conversation with Assemblyman Lewis. Fortunately, Mike had an appointment in Madison that Friday. And so he made an appointment with Lewis to meet with him that day when he would be in town. That morning, Mike met with Henry Curran, the senior resident agent of Madison, and our tech man, Rick Prokop, who wired him up. Of course, we had to get lots of approvals for this kind of a taping. The U.S. attorney approved, the special agent in charge in Milwaukee approved, had to get bureau authority because it was with a state politician. Everybody went along with the idea.
Had you done any type of taping or consensual monitoring of any of the other meetings that Mike had had together with Iwan and Clausen, with or without Lewis?
No, we hadn't.
And why'd you decide not to record any of those?
I think that's probably one of my deficiencies. I'm not a techie. I've had more bad things happen than good things. This happened to be one of the good things, but the use of the body recorder of course, we're going back to 1978 now. We didn't use it nearly as much as we have later on since then. And of course, in this case, anything involving Lewis required FBI headquarters authority. So I probably took the lines of the least resistance at that point. So that Friday, Mike went to Madison. The day before, I had gotten together with him and prepped him on some of the things to say. I have a strong belief that good tapes are made, not born. And The person making the tape was there not to be talking, but to be asking questions and listening. And we went over some of the questions he would ask. The day before, Iwan told Mike that he had information he wanted transmitted to Lewis, and he would try to get him this information to take along. Well, the information was supposedly a list of CIA agents in Taiwan that Iwan had obtained from a source here in northern Wisconsin. We later determined that that was from a former Air Force officer in Taiwan and may or may not have been true, but there was no way that we could allow this kind of information to be transmitted, not knowing what it was. Well, they missed connections and Iwan had to mail the information to Lewis, which just added another wrinkle. But on that Friday, October 3rd, we wired up Mike and he went to the state capitol in Madison and met with Assemblyman Lewis in Lewis's office. As far as I know, this is the only time that has ever happened. We've taped a state of Wisconsin official inside the state capitol. Nobody has told me differently. Lewis was expecting this CIA list, so it created part of the conversation. And Mike was able to explain that he hadn't gotten the list. But Lewis explained that he was going the following Tuesday to a function of the Taiwanese government in Chicago where he intended to pass the list. The whole idea of Taiwan is another wrinkle that hadn't appeared before. And on the tape, Mike asked Lewis about this. And Lewis said that was another possibility of a place they could go. They fully felt like the U.S. government had been so corrupted and become communist that they had to leave the country. That was really in the back of their minds. One of my questions to Mike to ask on the tape to Lewis, what's in it for you? And Lewis said if he were in Guatemala, he would have an army, a Mercedes at his disposal, could reside on a ranch. And you could tell Lewis had his financial reasons for wanting to do all of this. Lewis talked on the tape about being a politician. He would be protection for Mike. But now we had a new problem. We didn't have the list of CIA agents or supposed CIA agents, but we had to keep Lewis from passing it to somebody in Chicago the following Tuesday. Well, that Friday night, I dictated an urgent teletype to FBI headquarters telling them what was going on. It happened to be a 3-day weekend, the Columbus Day weekend and Monday holiday, and nothing happened until Tuesday morning when all hell broke loose. Headquarters called and said, get to Chicago. We can't allow this to happen. They'd already talked to Chicago about it. Chicago had really done their job. They found that the dinner was at a restaurant. Kayam is the name of a very nice Chinese restaurant in Chicago. I've eaten there. And that the Taiwanese government was sponsoring this reception that Lewis was attending. They determined that Lewis had reservations at a Holiday Inn on the lakefront at Chicago and had agents covering both of these locations. When I flew to Chicago, another of the little jokes that has come up out of this, I stopped at home and grabbed a toothbrush and a clean shirt. And later, when doing a book on this case, Sharon Thatcher, the author, said, well, what would your wife have said then? My wife, Pat, had been a bureau secretary. And I said, well, she knew the routine. She probably just said, good luck. Well, the little statement, I know the routine, good luck, has become a family joke among us as a result. Anyway, going to the Kayam restaurant, the agents in Chicago did a magnificent job of covering it. They picked up Lewis's car en route, followed it there. Just as Lewis approached the restaurant, a car pulled out of a parking place right across the street from the restaurant, and Lewis took that parking place. Well, who do you think that car belonged to? It was a perfect job.
So nice and convenient of you to make sure that he had that perfect parking space.
Oh, that wasn't on me. That was on the Chicago agents. They did a terrific job of this. There were 2 agents inside the Kayam reception watching Lewis and his girlfriend, and they socialized for a bit. And then it appeared that Lewis was leaving, as it turned out, was leaving for a private meeting with some Taiwanese officials, and the agents intercepted them and brought them into the Chicago office. At the Chicago office,
everyone?
No, just Lewis and his girlfriend were brought to the Chicago office. And the 2 agents that had been inside the reception and I interviewed Lewis. Other agents interviewed his girlfriend. But I confronted Lewis with the fact that he had a list of names and we wanted it. And he reached in his jacket pocket and pulled out a list of names and handed it over. He admitted that it was from Iwan, that it was supposed to be CIA agents in Taiwan. And I asked him why he had this list in his pocket. And he said, I had the intuition the FBI would be asking me for it. Now, what baloney that is, but that's what he said. We had a 2-hour interview, and through the interview, I covered all of the subjects in our case up here. He denied that his affiliations with Iwan, Clausen, Mike Muckerheide had anything to do with lasers. In fact, he said he believed Mike Muckerheide was a city planner. In the end, the Chicago agents drove Lewis and his girlfriend back to Madison. They went to the Capitol, where Lewis turned over letters from Colonel Fuentes that he had in his safe. They ordered him to turn in his passport the next day. I'm not sure you could get away with that today, but it happened. And the next morning, FBI headquarters said, we gave you an impossible job, and you succeeded, keeping that list from getting out of control.
But now Mike is definitely burned.
Well, the whole case is out in the open. We still had some work to do on that front. Immediately, we spread federal grand jury subpoenas to all the players, including Mike, as a cover. We immediately conducted interviews of Iwan, Clausen, and Mike, again, as a cover. I had Milwaukee agents do the interviews of Iwan, who wasn't very cooperative, and Mike, again, just as a cover, so he could say he was interviewed. And my partner and I interviewed John Clausen at his home. We had analyzed Clausen's position in all of this. And basically, he was an onlooker. He was somebody that didn't have anything really to gain by any of this. He wasn't making the laser weapons. He wasn't going out of the country. He was just going along for the excitement of it. And we wanted him on our side. In the interview, Clausen was evasive, but as it happened, his wife was present for the interview. And as we left and drove down the road, we both laughed about the fact that John no longer had the right to remain silent when his wife questioned him about what he had really been involved in. Now we were getting ready for the grand jury. All of our players and anybody remotely involved. I mentioned Colonel Roberts from one of these organizations. We had subpoenas to all these right-wing characters to go to the grand jury in Madison. Iwan talked to Mike and said that he suspected Clausen. That's what we wanted him to do. Iwan wanted them all to use the same posse attorney and to all to take the fifth. This was an opportunity for Mike to begin distancing himself from these guys, saying that he couldn't be involved in something like this. He'd better get his own attorney, that kind of thing. Just before the grand jury, Iwan made another trip to Guatemala and said that they had the money, they needed to bring the laser weapons. On October 25th, 1978, all of these players appeared before the federal grand jury in Madison. The grand jury room was at the end of a long hallway in the old federal building in Madison, and all these players were on the wood benches outside in the hallway. And a number of these right-wingers like Colonel Roberts were strutting up and down, sounding off on their politics. A posse attorney named Joe Weigel was present to represent Iwan and Clausen. Lewis told Mike in the hallway that in Chicago, in his FBI interview, he had told the FBI that Mike was a city planner, so Mike had better tell the grand jury he was a city planner. Well, of course, that didn't happen. Now, I should probably say right now that we're approaching what could be a problem of Federal Rule 6E. Grand jury material is secret. I will explain later why we are able to talk about all this, but I am able to legally talk about all that happened in the grand jury at that time. The first witness to the grand jury was Mike Muckerheide, and U.S. Attorney Frank Turkheimer took him through the entire story of the laser weaponry, Guatemala, and Lewis. Clausen and Iwan came next, basically took the Fifth Amendment, were evasive on some questions. Then Lewis came in, and he did what politicians do. He lied his ass off. He denied that there was any lasers involved. He didn't know anything about lasers. The trip to Guatemala was about him going there to photograph the ruins at Tikal. We used the grand jury to get handwriting samples from each of the three, Lewis, Iwan, and Clausen. We had the Iwan Der Führer letter. We had Lewis's notes on Fuentes in his own handwriting. And we had a little card that John Clausen had made out with codes of places to meet for their coffee meetings. And it included the word Apollo, their code for the jig is up. So as you know, when you dictate handwriting samples, you dictate what you want the person to write. I did this with first Lewis, then Iwan, and then Clausen. And we got to the end, and the last word I dictated was Apollo, and I kept doing it over and over and over again. And finally, Clausen looked at me and said, "How do you know about that?" And my answer was probably the most dramatic thing I did in my 32 years as an agent. Do yourself a favor and get your own lawyer and contact us. And the next day, we got a call from a Wausau lawyer representing Clausen, and it ended up with a complete interview that Saturday, a sworn signed statement, which we introduced to the grand jury, and which corroborated everything Mike had been telling us for a couple of years now. Iwan's laser plan was now completely terminated. The investigation and prosecution took us another year, but at this point, it gave Mike a reason to distance himself from the other players. Of course, there are lots of follow-up interviews, records to be subpoenaed, like bank records and the travel records, Iwan buying the tickets. All of this was going on for months. I began having problems with our own headquarters and our military sources stonewalling us regarding laser weapons. We needed to be able to tell the grand jury what these laser weapons could do for the believability issue of the whole case. As Frank Turkheimer was working out his prosecutive strategy for the case, it included talking to Lewis's attorney. And as a result, Lewis agreed to cooperate and plead guilty to lying to the grand jury and to testify against the other people in a laser conspiracy. Well, I think Lewis's agreement to do this was really to mask the depth of his treachery to our own government. So this is almost a year later now. On August 27th, 1979, in federal court in Madison, before Judge James Doyle, Frank Turkheimer filed an information charging Lewis with perjury to the federal grand jury, and Lewis pleaded guilty. Judge Doyle accepted the plea, set sentencing for 30 days. This was the first the public knew anything about this, and of course it caused a lot of stir in the media about what was going on. Why was Lewis guilty of lying to the grand jury? One of the fun things about it was that Frank had notified the grand jurors to have them all present in the audience at the courtroom when Lewis' surprise appearance to plead guilty happened. I overheard one of them saying, "This is the big one," and it certainly was for their term in the grand jury. His sentencing was on November 8th, 1979. He was sentenced to 6 months incarceration in federal prison with 30 days off for good behavior if he had it. And that was to start on December 3rd of 1979. Lewis was sent to a federal prison camp at Leavenworth, Kansas. Meanwhile, in that month of November of 79, Lewis ran unopposed for his position in the State House and was reelected unopposed. Of course, once he was convicted and sent to prison, his position was vacated. After that sentencing in December of 1979, U.S. Attorney Turkheimer announced that that was the end of the case. This was a surprise to Mike. It was a surprise to me. I later learned from our new special agent in charge, John Glover, that the Department of Justice had directed Frank Turkheimer that he didn't make the prosecutive decisions in espionage cases. They made the decisions in the espionage cases.
But you have other subjects. I mean, what about Iwan?
That was the immediate question. Fortunately for us, it just so happened that Secret Service in Milwaukee had a counterfeiting case in which Iwan had surfaced. The trail directly led to him distributing counterfeit U.S. currency from the posse. So in early 1980, they arrested Iwan, and he pled guilty to counterfeiting and was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. So that solved that part of the case, very fortunately for us.
Did it really for you? Were you satisfied that they found another way to charge him and that he wasn't charged with this espionage, domestic terrorism matter that you had spent so much time on?
Well, to say that I was dissatisfied, yeah, I certainly wasn't happy with that. We've all lived with decisions of U.S. attorneys and the Department of Justice that we're unhappy with, and this was certainly one for me, but I had no choice but to accept it. At least I knew that Iwan would be out of the picture.
Explain again to all of us why they didn't want to go through with the original charge. Was it simply because they didn't want to have to talk about laser technology?
That's my belief, yes. I don't know for certain, but I know that we had a lot of problems with our own headquarters and the military about what laser weaponry could do. So at this point, Lewis was in prison and he began backpedaling, filing motions to try to vacate his conviction. In fact, I was even sent to Leavenworth to interview him in the counterfeiting case. The U.S. attorney in Milwaukee had asked me to go interview him in the counterfeiting case, and he had really become institutionalized quickly. He was a real jerk. Fortunately, Judge Doyle rejected his motions to vacate the conviction, and Judge Doyle was so incensed by this behavior on Lewis's part that he placed the federal grand jury testimony all in the public record in the court clerk's file. So now Rule 6E is not a problem. We can talk about it because it's all in that court clerk's file. Well, at this point, the newspapers, really almost by accident, began to discover the whole nature of the case in the grand jury file. I'm not sure why a Detroit newspaper was involved, but they were. The West Bend, Wisconsin newspaper, which was Lewis's hometown, and our Wausau Daily Herald reporter, Pat Rupinski, really got into investigating all of this himself. And Pat Rupinski really had the case right. He had gone through the whole grand jury. He had done his own homework. He even had me read his draft of his article for the newspaper, which is pretty unprecedented, really. I guess it speaks to our relationship with our reporters in a small town. But he had it just right. And then his management at Gannett Publications wouldn't print what he had. They watered down the article. And again, whether it's the believability factor, I don't know. But Pat Rupinski quit the newspaper. He had a long and successful career in the news media in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. But the believability issue was always present. I have a little bit of that worry. If we had ever gone to trial with this case, what would a juror do? You just never know about those kind of things. So, yeah, I'm unhappy that we never really aired it out in court. But because of what Judge Doyle did with the grand jury testimony, it really got it out into the public. And that's really where we need it. I think we need the public understanding that we're doing our job. Whether we see somebody go for a long stretch or a short stretch isn't my call, maybe. In the aftermath of all this, Mike was a real laser pioneer. He had a number of medical patents. I had mentioned he'd established laser programs at a couple of institutions here in northern Wisconsin. He went to work at St. Mary's Hospital in Milwaukee. He had experiments on the space shuttle with NASA. He was a consultant of the Department of Defense. If you'll recall, on the Iraq War, when we had videos of missiles going down the smokestack of a factory in Baghdad, these were laser-guided missiles, and Mike's connection with Department of Defense had a lot to do with that. There are exhibits from Mike at the Smithsonian, the Milwaukee Museum of Flight at the Milwaukee Airport. Mike retired from St. Mary's Hospital, and his wife died in 2001. Mike died of cancer in December of 2003 at the age of 73. Iwan, the chemist, went back to his career as a chemist, worked in the natural foods industry. Interestingly, he married the sister of Colonel Fuentes and lived in Merrill, which is the community where I live. I would occasionally run into him. He and his wife had several children and went through the Merrill school system. I believe they divorced. Iwan died in a one-car accident in 2011 at age 81.
And I take it he never developed a cancer cure drug.
He did not. And Laetrile was never given permission by the FDA to be produced. Clausen remained in the financial business. He and I continued our contacts and became very friendly. John Clausen died of cancer in 2004 at age 57. This was one of my real worries when we subsequently began writing about this case. We had truth on our side, but truth would certainly affect Clausen's business. And so his death during the course of this was unfortunate for him, but it was very fortunate for the ultimate publication of the book on this laser case. Lewis went back to West Bend, Wisconsin. He married his secretary, Debbie. They operated a natural foods store in West Bend. He became a lobbyist for the natural food industry, a lay minister. He died in Wisconsin Dells in 2020 at age 84. Colonel Fuentes became Brigadier General Fuentes, Deputy Defense Minister of Guatemala. He died in a single-engine plane crash in Guatemala in 1989 at age 53. Frank Turkheimer, after his term as U.S. Attorney, went back to Professor of Law at the University of Wisconsin, retired there. Frank died about a year ago. His daughter, the last I'd heard, was an assistant U.S. Attorney. I just heard this morning that she is now a professor at Northwestern University School of Law. I guess I'm the Lone Ranger from this case. I'm the last guy directly affiliated with it that's still around, which is one of the reasons I certainly wanted to let this be known to everybody that this really did happen.
And the great thing is that you got together with author Sharon Thatcher, and everything is now recorded and memorialized in this book, The Laser's Edge, The Conspiracy Code Word to Call. And you loaned me a copy of the book, and it was fascinating to read and to get a really good understanding of lasers and how they were trying to use them for evil.
Yeah.
We're talking about a case in the mid to late 70s. But as we all know, there are still domestic terrorism groups, extremist groups, right-wing groups that are planning actions all the time. In your case, nobody died, nobody was killed. There were no buildings that were blown up, no damage was done. And I think that is one of the things that people still have a hard time understanding, that it's the responsibility of the FBI to get involved in these things before things happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but there are still cases where, they come to trial and someone's saying they were just talking, they were just planning. They didn't have the means, like in this particular case, they didn't have the money. That doesn't mean that we should allow them to continue, because at some stage, we don't know if they're going to get the means, if they're going to get the financial ability to follow through on their plans.
I fully agree with you. As I said, if this were the movies, they'd make a doomsday weapon, it would get out of control, and that would make a plot for the movie. But this story has been looked at by some movie people. Nobody has jumped on it at this point, and I think you've probably hit on the reason. It isn't dramatic enough for them.
They want somebody to die. They want some damage to be done. But again, it's law enforcement's purpose to stop that threat before that happens.
Yes, sometimes you can be so successful you don't get credit.
And I guess that's the difference with this movie that I talked about, The Order, because there was a dramatic shootout in which the subjects were killed, and that makes good drama. That makes good movies.
Or writing.
Or writing. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. This has been a fantastic case review. What I like to do is give everybody a chance to get to know my guest a little bit more. So I'm going to ask my standard question to you now. When and why you joined the FBI?
Well, okay. It probably requires a little background of me. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, kind of a unique small town, Green Hills, Ohio. That was one of the 3 communities built by the government during the Depression, planned community. I attended a small college in Ohio, majored in math and chemistry because that's what I did well. During my senior year in college, I discovered the position of special agent of the FBI. I qualified in every way except age. When I graduated from undergraduate school, I would only be 22. So at that point, I had an offer to go to graduate school in chemistry, a fellowship in chemistry to the University of Idaho, and I couldn't turn that down. I had to go see what that was all about, which I did. Well, fairly early on in my grad school career, I figured out that I was not the kind of person to become a theoretical chemist. I contacted the FBI, and one of their programs was that they hired scientists possibly for the FBI laboratory. I applied, and with that career path, I received my appointment letter in about May of 1967. My appointment was for September, so it allowed me to finish off my master's degree in chemistry at the University of Idaho. I might say one thing about the upbringing because it's something that's still in my mind and I don't have an answer to. From my senior year high school football team, 3 of us had careers as FBI agents. And our coach went on to coach at the University of Cincinnati, and I know 2 other FBI agents that played for him there. Now, what is that in that upbringing that brought us all together in the FBI? I don't know the answer, but I think it's a combination of time and place.
Very interesting. So did you spend the rest of your career in Wisconsin?
Out of training, I went to the Jackson office, Jackson, Mississippi, the end of 1967. As you know, that was the Bureau's plan. Send us out to the field for a while to learn what the job was all about. And when I first heard that I was going to Mississippi, we all had Mississippi burning in our minds at that time. I remember when I opened my appointment letter, I made a face because I didn't know what that would be all about. I couldn't have been more wrong. I loved what I did in Jackson. I loved the work we did. The Jackson Division is primarily made up of resident agents. I saw these old timers who were great role models as criminal investigators, and that's what I wanted to do. Fall of 68, I was transferred to Chicago. I worked on the fugitive squad, spending all day tracking down and arresting fugitives. There couldn't be more fun in a Bureau career than that. They were expanding resident agencies out of Chicago. I put in for and was transferred to the Waukegan Resident Agency, where I served from the end of 69 until 1977. Meanwhile, I'd had a couple of requests from headquarters to see if I wanted to transfer to the lab, and I declined and said I really liked what I was doing and thought I was a better fit for the field than the lab. And finally, they let me alone and let me stay in the field, which is what I have loved doing. My wife was born in Wisconsin, so I was able to see the grass was greener across the state line in Wisconsin than it was in Illinois. Put in for our office of preference in Wisconsin. And right at my 10-year mark in the Bureau, was transferred to the Milwaukee Division. Special agent in charge, Jerry Hogan, worked it out for me to be senior resident agent in Wausau. And I spent the rest of my remaining 22 years of my 32-year career as senior resident agent at Wausau, Wisconsin.
So when did you retire? And everybody listening to this podcast knows that when an FBI agent retires, that doesn't mean they're going to go home and sit around. So what did you do? And then let's get into what are you doing now? Because we have something in common when it comes to that.
Well, I retired on July 31st, 1999. I didn't have any real plans. Our daughter had just graduated from high school, was going off to college, but I could see the creep of computers and some things in the Bureau that were changing the Bureau in a way that I didn't particularly like. I had plenty of time in, so I retired. I did a little consulting. That didn't work out too well. People don't respond to you the same way when you don't have that federal badge in your pocket. Our daughter had been a figure skater growing up. The U.S. Figure Skating Association tapped me to help them with their security at their major events, and I was security advisor for U.S. Figure Skating from 2001, right after 9/11, until 2004. My interest had always been in trains, railroads, railroad history. I'm a railroad historian. I wrote a book on the history of a railroad in Idaho, which was published by the Museum of North Idaho in 2003. I just kept on doing what I did. I have 20 some other nonfiction books on railroad history that I've done since then. Sharon Thatcher, the author of the Laser's Edge book, who was a local newspaper editor, after she left that job, she and I had a small publishing business, Merrill Publishing Associates, which did a number of our railroad history books. We also published the On the Laser's Edge book ourselves that way. It is available on Amazon. So that led to my most recent career in retirement, and that is of a fiction author.
And what made you decide to do that?
It started, I think, with, I would tell stories like all retired Bureau agents occasionally tell stories of a case we worked on or a situation we encountered. And people would say, you ought to write a book. Well, I didn't consider myself to be that kind of an author. I met a lot of characters in my career that I thought I could write about, and I thought I could do dialogue because I was a reasonably good interviewer, taught interviewing for a while. But it wasn't until I realized that I could take the plots from some of my Bureau cases and fictionalize them in a way that I could then write fiction novels. And so I don't call them mysteries. I don't call them whodunits, but I now have 4 crime story novels that I've penned.
Tell us more about it. You have a series that you call the Accidental Sheriff series.
Yes, actually, Amazon is the one who dubbed it that. The title of my first crime story is Accidental Sheriff. My main character is an FBI agent in Wausau, Wisconsin named Thomas T. Thomas, who retires, and his wife finds a home up on the shore of Lake Superior for them to retire, and they move up there for a quiet retirement. Soon after, the incumbent sheriff is found shot to death on the beach, and the governor taps Tommy Thomas to be the sheriff of Gitchigumi County, Wisconsin. And so Coda is the name of the little town, the county seat of Gitchigumi County, Wisconsin. And my stories just flow from there to the next at that location. My main character only works out that one term as sheriff, the accidental sheriff. He then is appointed by the next sheriff as a very special deputy, which is the title of my second work. And he helps the department mentoring their new investigator, helping them with serious crimes and more major cases. My third is entitled Cop Logic, doing some of the same things and applying the logic that we cops have based upon our experience that maybe members of the general public don't have. And then the most recent one is about more devious crimes. The title is Devious. And it's the one I'm probably have had the most fun with, mainly because of the cover. Along the way, I discovered that there is a real Thomas T. Thomas in California. Mr. Thomas owns a winery and is a winemaker. He can't sell wine to me from California to here. He can't ship it. But he sent me some wine labels to give away at book signings or book sales. And on those wine labels was some fantastic modern art. I asked him where he got his artwork, and he said, I do it myself. I'm the artist. And so when I was writing the book Devious, I asked if he had anything that I might use on the cover, and he sent me this fantastic modern art to go on the cover. If my writing is a fraction as good as the cover of that book, I'll be very pleased. You can tell a book by its cover.
Well, I will put the image of your last book, Devious, in the show notes for this episode, and I will also put a link to where everyone can find your books.
Great. Thank you.
I like to give my guest the last word. So what would you like to say?
Well, in now being a writer of nonfiction, a writer of fiction, I belong to a very interesting writers group here in our small town in Wisconsin. There are a number of really good poets, and I will just say the only poem that I've ever written, probably the only poem I ever will write. The thing we most regret in life are those we didn't do. Be brave, just do it now, do it again, no regrets. That would be a philosophy I've lived by, one I still approve of, and it suits me fine.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find photos of Tom Burg and images and articles from the laser weaponry conspiracy case, as well as a link to the book he wrote with author Sharon Thatcher, On the Laser's Edge, The Conspiracy, Code Word to Call, and links to where you can purchase Tom's crime novels. There are also links to 2 more FBI Retired Case File Review episodes featuring investigations of extremist groups from the 1970s and 1980s. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist, where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.